Colombia is Colombia has far and away the worst human rights record in Latin America since around 1990. After, through the 80s, the worst atrocities were carried out by the U.S.-backed dictatorships. El Salvador, Guatemala was probably the worst, and so on. Through the 90s, Colombia got the championship, became the leading human rights violator, and almost reflexively, it became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the hemisphere. Now, Colombia has a long history of violence and terror and so on. It took off again in the 90s, and it became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid outside of Turkey. Turkey was carrying out even more atrocities, so they were ahead of Colombia. By the late 90s, the Turkish atrocities declined and Colombia moved into first place. Actually, I'm putting aside Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. But outside that category, Colombia won the championship in the Western Hemisphere and then in the world by the late 90s. That was called Plan Colombia. It was a Clinton plan. It was technically directed against, it was supposedly directed against drug trafficking, but it's mostly counterinsurgency. I mean, I actually have been down there in southern Colombia. It's a miserable place. The peasants down there are the campesinos, the Afro-Colombians, indigenous people are being attacked by everybody you can imagine. They're being attacked by the military, by the paramilitaries. Now they're being attacked by FARC, the guerrillas. One of probably the only real achievement of Plan Colombia, Clinton's Plan Colombia, was to militarize the conflict so completely that the guerrilla movements, which had some kind of a social base and social programs, just turned into another army preying on the peasants. So now they're under attack by all of them, but probably the worst of all is the U.S. Air Force, or actually, it's called the Colombian Air Force, but the U.S. planes, probably mercenaries flying them, who are carrying out chemical warfare and just destroying everything. It's called fumigation, and it's supposedly, it's supposed to kill coca plants, but of course it kills everything else too. And what it does is it drives the peasants off the land, and Colombia now has the second largest displaced persons population in the world after Sudan. They're all off in the slums somewhere around the cities. And as soon as they're driven off the land, in come the big mining corporations, and agribusiness, and Monsanto with monocrop, genetically modified agriculture, and ranches owned by rich people, and so on. And it's a real horror story. Actually, just to tell you, I was supposed to go down there right after Christmas. But just a couple of days ago, I was told by human rights activists that it's too violent to go there, so you can't go right now. Well, okay, that's called pacification or something. The Colombian government is the one close U.S. ally. It stands out from the region, and that's why the bases went to Colombia. This question of the drugs is something that really ought to be thought about. I mean, it is taken for granted in the United States that we have the right to establish military bases in other countries, to send troops in, and CIA and DEA agents and so on, to get them to stop producing a product that we don't like. Now, hard drugs aren't good for anybody, but if you compare it with, say, tobacco, I mean, it's undetectable. Deaths from tobacco are way higher than deaths from all the hard drugs together, and soft drugs like cannabis, marijuana. Maybe it's not good for you, but it's not a killer. Furthermore, tobacco kills other people. Way more people die from passive smoking than die from hard drugs. Passive smoking, meaning you're around somebody who's smoking. Suppose that, say, China established military bases in Colombia to carry out chemical warfare in Kentucky and North Carolina to destroy this lethal crop that's killing huge numbers of Chinese. I mean, is that all right? I mean, it's part of the imperial mentality is it doesn't register. Since we're the owners of the world, we can do anything we want, you know. And if we want to, say, you know, invade Afghanistan because we don't like somebody, or we want to carry out chemical warfare in southern Colombia because they're doing something we claim that, then okay, we have a perfect right to do it. All right, putting that aside, you have to really ask yourself whether controlling cocoa production has anything to do with the purpose of all of this. I mean, there's a principle of law, well-known principle of law, that you can infer intention from predictable consequences of actions, okay? Now, for decades, the United States has been fighting what's called a drug war to try to get rid of, say, opium production. It's had essentially no effect on opium production, but it has had other effects, perfectly predictable effects. In Colombia, it's a cover for counterinsurgency. In the United States, it's a technique for reintroducing slavery. What it's done, in effect, in the United States, since the drug war was escalated by Nixon, a little bit after that, mainly since the Reagan years, is to just shoot the incarceration rate up to the sky, and it's mostly black males. Well, you look at the history of African Americans, it's been slavery all the way. I mean, everybody knows, you know, that aside from free blacks, it was slavery up till the Civil War. But what is less known is that there was a period, 10-year period called Reconstruction, when there was sort of kind of freedom. But after Reconstruction, there was a compact of the North and the South to essentially reinstitute slavery. And the way it was done was by criminalizing black life. So if a black man is standing on a street corner and, you know, you can arrest him for vagrancy. If he doesn't look down properly when a white woman passes, you can arrest him for, you know, attempted rape or something. And once they're in jail, they're there forever, because you can't pay the judges and you can't pay the lawyers and so on. So essentially black life was criminalized, and you had a new slave class, which was worse than slavery, for good capitalist reasons. If you own a slave, he's capital. You got to maintain him. If you're just taking a slave out of the criminal system and putting him to work in a mine or a factory, he's dispensable. It's kind of like free labor. You just throw him out. So, in fact, it was worse than slavery. And it's the basis for a large part of the American Industrial Revolution. The mines and the steel mills and so on, a lot of it was in the southern areas where it was based on slave labor. Well, that went on until the Second World War. During the Second World War, you needed free labor for, you know, war plants and so on. And then for a couple of decades after the Second World War, there was a substantial economic growth, industrial growth. So black men could get jobs as auto workers, and, you know, they could start moving into relatively decent life. Well, by the 70s, that essentially was over. The economy moved towards financialization, towards elimination of the industrial production. The neoliberal policies were introduced. You've got this huge superfluous population again. What do you do with them? Throw them into jail. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So the consequence of the drug war here was primarily, domestically, it was to re-incarcerate a large part of the black population, also Hispanic population, and to and in fact, they are again factory labor. So they're cheap and easily exploitable labor. It's called voluntary, but when you're in jail, you know, voluntary has a special meaning. But and you know, when people complain about, say, Guantanamo, it's kind of a little ironic, because American prisons aren't that much different. I mean, they're torture chambers. It's a horrible system. So that's one effect at home. The effect abroad is counterinsurgency. And there were other consequences. It's a way of frightening the rest of the population here, imposing what's called law and order. So if you want to frighten and control the population, they have to be afraid of something. And they can be afraid of, Hispanic narco-traffickers trying to destroy us and that sort of thing. And that worked very well. So it's had and the fact that it consistently fails in its alleged purpose, namely reducing drug use or even availability of drugs, doesn't matter because it's succeeding in its actual purposes. You'd think that we'd be able to understand that. In fact, the three quite conservative Latin American ex-presidents, Zedillo, Cardozo, and Gaviria, I think, about a year ago, headed a study which called for just elimination of the drug war. They said it's got nothing to do with controlling drugs. And a lot of Latin American countries, I don't know if Honduras is involved, but others are just slowly decriminalizing drugs for personal use and so on. The U.S. wants to maintain it, but I think that's because it has other functions. Now, Colombia is right at the center of this. Colombia may not be the main producer of poppy anymore. It very well might be Mexico. Mexico is now a major narco state. There are huge areas of Mexico near the border which are just given over to the northern border, U.S. border, to opium production. And the U.S. pretends it doesn't know anything about it. But journalists in Mexico say that you can just, fly over it in a Piper Cub or something. You can just see it. You can't miss it. A lot of these are areas from which the population essentially fled as a result of NAFTA, which undermines agricultural production. It's one of its purposes. So people flee to the cities, and you have big open areas, and the drug cartels pick them up, and they're apparently protected by the army and the narco-traffickers who work together. And it's claimed that about 25% of the Mexican economy is now just narco-trafficking. But we don't decertify Mexico because it's an ally. But Colombia is the one real holdout in Latin America so far. But it's a pretty ugly place. On the other hand, to get back to an earlier question, I don't really think it can be used as a base for attacking other places in Latin America. There's just not the capacity for that. Mm-hmm.